Hello, everyone. This is Six Path Weeb, and I'm excited to welcome you all to my YouTube anime fanfiction channel. Today, we're diving into another thrilling episode of our ongoing series, What If a Female Deku Had a Transmutation Quirk? Part 3. Before we begin, a quick disclaimer. The content on this channel is purely for entertainment and discussion purposes. I do not own any of the anime footage used, all rights and credits belong to their respective creators and copyright holders. Now, without further ado, let's jump right in. Deku let out a quiet, weary sigh as she gazed at her reflection in the mirror, carefully examining herself for any signs of last night's incident. Given the intense pain she had endured, she half expected to find burns or marks on her body, especially on her chest, where the sensation had been the strongest. To her relief, her skin remained unscathed, with no visible injuries. However, just because there were no external wounds didn't mean everything was fine internally. She considered various ways to check for any internal damage, ultimately deciding that activating her thermal vision would be the most effective. While she felt normal, it wouldn't hurt to confirm that no residual heat had built up inside her body. Focusing her quirk, she attempted to channel it into her eyes, but the effort was met with a sudden, piercing headache and a sharp pain in both eyes. She winced, squeezing them shut, but the discomfort lingered. What was happening? She had used transmutation countless times before without issue. Why was this time different? Hesitantly, she opened her eyes, half expecting to see blood trailing down her face in the mirror. However, her reflection appeared completely normal. Letting out a relieved sigh, she almost did a double take when her gaze drifted to her abdomen. It was glowing. But not in the usual way transmutations manifested. Instead, it looked as though two distinct lights were shining from within her. On the left side, directly over her heart, pulsed a deep green glow, one that felt strangely familiar. Tendrils of energy, resembling veins, extended outward from it, weaving through her entire body, her arms, torso, and legs, anchoring themselves deep within her. On the right side of her torso, a second light radiated, a bright yellow that was beginning to take on hints of green at its edges. This one also had tendrils, though they were far less extensive, only reaching a short distance into her body. She raised a hand to her chest, pressing against it, but the glowing orbs remained visible even through her palm. Somehow, she could see through her own body. Narrowing her eyes, she concentrated on the green sphere. It shifted constantly, swirling in an endless, chaotic motion, folding and unraveling upon itself as if caught in an eternal storm. It was transmuting. Realization struck her like a spark of insight. It was her quirk. That explained why it felt so familiar and why its tendrils had spread so thoroughly throughout her system. The glowing lights. Could they be representations of her abilities? As of yesterday, she didn't just have one quirk anymore, she had two. If the green glow represented her original transmutation ability, then the yellow light had to be one for all. Unlike transmutation, which pulsed with restless energy, one for all remained steady, firmly anchored where her right lung should be. Looking closer, she noticed something else, a thin tendril of energy linking the two orbs. It was faint, barely noticeable, but the connection was there. Could this be the result of one for all integrating itself into her body alongside her existing quirk? Her gaze shifted, sweeping over the rest of her form, when she caught sight of something new. A very dim light, so faint she almost missed it, outlined her brain in a deep purple hue. Intrigued, she focused on it, watching as it pulsed gently, similar to one for all. With every pulse, tiny specks of different colors flickered to life within it. It looked like a miniature galaxy, a swirling nebula right inside her mind. Fascinated, she considered what it could mean. Could she not only perceive quirks but also monitor her own brain activity? The tiny glowing specks were likely her neurons, firing off rapidly with every thought. Before she could analyze it further, she blinked, and just like that, the mysterious ability faded away. She stood there in silence, deep in thought. What had just happened? Some kind of quirk sensing vision? No, that didn't fully explain what she had seen. If it were just that, she wouldn't have been able to observe her brain's activity in such detail. Perhaps it had something to do with her nervous system. Quirks were physical abilities, and considering how transmutation had spread throughout her entire body while one for all had rooted itself so firmly, it wasn't impossible that her perception had expanded in a new way. She blinked a few times, attempting to summon whatever strange effect she had just triggered, but all she managed to do was give herself another painful headache and an intense, stabbing sensation in her eyes. With a tired sigh, she finally pulled away from the mirror, shuffling back to her room to get ready for her morning run with Katsuki. Later that day. Deku was in the middle of getting dressed for her training session with All Might when her phone buzzed, vibrating slightly to indicate a new text message. She slipped on her navy green t-shirt, then leaned over to check her smartphone. It was a message from All Might. Quickly unlocking her phone, her emerald eyes scanned the screen. Our training location has been compromised. Training is temporarily cancelled while I secure an alternative site. Deku raised an eyebrow. She knew that Takoba Beach would become a popular destination now that it had been cleaned up, but this soon? She had only just finished clearing the area yesterday. Had word already spread about the transformation? Tapping a thoughtful finger against her chin, she picked up her phone and began typing. That was fast. We could use the dojo Kachan and I train in if that works for you? Her phone buzzed almost instantly. The first thing she noticed was a thumbs down emoji. We need a larger area that can accommodate one for all properly. The dojo would be at risk of damage. Deku chuckled at the thought. She had yet to fully control one for all. In fact, she still struggled to activate it without interference from her secondary quirk, Transmutation. The last thing she wanted was to accidentally damage half the dojo during training. Alright. Do you have another location in mind? How long will it take to secure a new training site? 3 days at most. Use this time to rest, you've been working hard. A small smile crossed Deku's face. It had been quite a while since she last visited May. Her intense training schedule with All Might had taken up the time she used to spend at Hatsume's workshop. Scrolling through her contact list, she found May's number and decided she would focus on her quirk training tomorrow. 2 days later. Toshinori let out a quiet sigh, his long fingers lightly tapping together as he stared down at his steaming cup of tea. Looking up, he met Principal Nezu's inquisitive gaze as the small creature sipped from his own porcelain cup of green tea. Toshinori had fully expected Nezu to agree without hesitation. After all, who would refuse a request from the symbol of peace? But the principal had not immediately accepted his proposal. His request was straightforward. He wanted to grant his protégé access to UA's campus, particularly its extensive training grounds, in order to provide her with a proper environment for mastering one for all. Nezu, however, had set a condition. If that condition was met, Deku would be granted access to the school's facilities. Not only that, but she would receive guidance from other professional heroes during her training. On paper, the condition seemed simple. But in reality, it carried significant consequences that Toshinori wasn't sure he was ready to face. Nezu's requirement? That Deku be formally sponsored as a recommended student. This meant that, to some extent, their connection would become public knowledge. Even if primarily known only among other recommendation students, rumors would spread quickly. News of a student personally mentored by All Might would be impossible to contain. There was a reason Toshinori kept his personal relationships discreet. As the symbol of peace, he had many adversaries, some ruthless enough to target those close to him. His mind briefly wandered to the possibility of All for One discovering his mentorship of Deku. Would the villain be angered? Indifferent? Would he view her as a potential vulnerability to exploit? Shaking off those thoughts, Toshinori reminded himself that he hadn't heard any mention of All for One in years. As Deku had speculated, it was possible that the villain was still in a coma. Weighing his options, Toshinori considered the potential benefits and risks once more. On one hand, sponsoring Deku would provide undeniable advantages, access to state-of-the-art training facilities and guidance from seasoned pro heroes. Toshinori was many things: a hero, a symbol of peace, and a powerhouse of strength. But what he was not was a trained instructor. If he was being honest, the past few months of training had mostly consisted of him overseeing Deku while she handled the bulk of the work on her own. On the other hand, declining Nezu's offer would mean Deku's anonymity remained intact, ensuring her safety. He remained deep in thought, his tea long since gone cold, before finally breaking the silence. Very well. Nezu, now on his third cup of tea, raised a curious eyebrow. I accept your proposal, Toshinori confirmed. A knowing smile spread across Nezu's face. Toshinori had to admit, Nezu was a highly intelligent strategist, always finding ways to achieve his objectives. Letting out a heavy sigh, the blonde hero tapped his fingers against his lips in contemplation. So, when would you like to begin? Nezu asked, his tone laced with curiosity. He was clearly eager to meet his new student. Tomorrow, All Might replied. Would 5 p.m. work? Nezu nodded. I will ensure the training area is prepared and assemble a few staff members to observe the first session. The following day. Deku felt nervous. Her stomach twisted into knots, but despite the nerves, Excitement bubbled beneath the surface. Not only had All Might found a training field, but it was also at none other than UA, and to make things even more nerve-wracking, the principal and a few faculty members would be observing her first training session. She stepped into the large building labeled TDL in bold yellow letters. Almost immediately, she was met with the sight of All Might standing proudly in his muscle form, hands planted firmly on his hips. Beside him stood a small, white mouse? It took her a moment to process, but she quickly recognized the creature as none other than Principal Nezu, a brilliant being gifted with a quirk that exponentially enhanced his intelligence. She was so taken aback by Nezu's presence that she barely noticed the other pro-hero standing next to All Might, a tall man with dark gray skin and a chiseled face. Cementos. Deku took a steadying breath, her inner hero enthusiast screaming at her to ask for an autograph, but she pushed the thought away. Looking around, she realized that even more pro-heroes had gathered. Midnight, Vlad King, and an orange caterpillar? No, wait, her gaze narrowed at the strange sight. The caterpillar had dark, shaggy hair, and its eyes were shut tightly. Was it snoring? Before she could dwell on it, Midnight turned, her booted foot swinging in a swift motion as she kicked the strange creature in the midsection. Deku winced. That had to hurt. The caterpillar groggily stirred, red-rimmed eyes blinking open. Oh? The voice was faint but clear. Have we started already? As the figure shifted, Deku finally noticed the zipper running down the center of the strange cocoon. Oh. Oh. That wasn't a caterpillar. It was a sleeping bag. A thin, scruffy-looking man emerged, clad in a black jumpsuit with a scarf draped around his neck. He rubbed the sleep from his eyes lazily. If it weren't for the distinctive slitted goggles resting around his neck, she might not have recognized him at all. Eraserhead, the Erasure Hero. All Might cleared his throat, snapping Deku's attention back to the present. Principal Nezu observed her expectantly, and only then did she realize she had spent the past few minutes gawking at the heroes instead of introducing herself as planned. She quickly straightened and gave a polite bow. My apologies. My name is Midoriya Deku. It's an honor to meet you. Nezu's whiskers twitched as he smiled. My name is Nezu, and I am the principal of UA. He then tilted his head slightly, a thoughtful glint in his eyes. Before we begin your training, I'd like to conduct a small test. All Might's brow arched, clearly caught off guard. A test? Nezu nodded. While I have no doubt that your skills are impressive, given All Might's endorsement, I'd still like to see them firsthand. Deku tilted her head curiously. A quirk demonstration? Nezu chuckled. Something like that. Before she could ask what he meant, she noticed Eraserhead approaching, securing a weighted guard to his wrist. Judging by its bulk, it was designed to restrict movement and add resistance, training weights. This, Nezu gestured toward Aizawa, who was settling into a relaxed yet alert stance, will be your first test. Quirkless hand-to-hand combat. A spark of excitement flickered in Deku's chest. A sparring session, just like the one she had with Katsuki. But this time, against a pro-hero who specialized in combat. The challenge was thrilling. Even with the weights limiting his speed, Aizawa was bound to be a formidable opponent. All Might, would you mind stepping back to give them space? Nezu asked. All Might sighed but complied, stepping away with a nervous glance at his student. Though he trusted Deku's abilities, this was unexpected. Nezu always had a way of surprising people. Cementos placed his hands on the ground, and with a simple gesture, the concrete shifted, forming a raised circular platform about 30 feet in diameter, an arena for the spar. Eraserhead remained as unreadable as ever. You have 3 minutes. If you're immobilized or forced out of bounds, you lose. Ready? A distinctly feminine voice rang out. Deku turned to see Midnight, a flogger raised high in her hand. Aizawa stood still, unreadable. Deku gave a firm nod. That was all Midnight needed. The whip cracked through the air. Hajime. Deku loved sparring. Beyond practice, it was one of the best ways to sharpen her instincts, allowing her to shut off her thoughts and rely purely on movement. But Aizawa was fast. Faster than Katsuki, even with the weights. Deku barely had time to react before he lunged forward, yellow goggles flashing. She crossed her arms instinctively to block an open palm strike aimed at her midsection. Even through her guard, the impact sent her stumbling backward. Aizawa didn't let up. In a fluid motion, he twisted his body, launching a roundhouse kick toward her head. Too fast. Acting on instinct, she dropped to her knees, the kick slicing just above her. She had no time to analyze his movements, he left no openings. So she did the only thing she could do. Springing up from her crouch, she charged forward, ramming her shoulder into his abdomen. He grunted, sliding back a few feet, but before she could follow up, his hands gripped her waist. With a sharp pivot, he threw her aside. Deku landed in a controlled roll, stopping just short of the perimeter. Aizawa seized the chance, closing the distance in an instant. He launched another roundhouse kick. She reacted faster this time, ducking low and attempting to sweep his legs out from under him. Aizawa scoffed. A basic move. He countered with a swift backflip, and before Deku could react, his heel connected with her chin. She gasped at the impact, tumbling backward, just inches from the edge of the circle. Aizawa skidded to a stop, observing her unmoving form. Huh? Did I overdo it? She was still breathing, so she hadn't blacked out. Dazed? Too bad. He wasn't the type to give breathers. He charged in to end the match. But just as he moved to strike, Deku sprang into action. With a sudden burst of movement, she flipped onto her hands and launched herself backward, her foot connecting squarely with Aizawa's face. The hero staggered slightly, surprised. Then, much to Deku's shock, he grinned. That cheeky little brat. Deku mirrored the expression, a grin creeping onto her face as she wiped away the trickle of blood that had seeped past her lips. Eraserhead watched as the teenager pushed herself to her feet, eager to engage once again, but Aizawa simply shook his head, signaling toward midnight. Not bad, brat. Not bad at all, he remarked, lowering his goggles so they rested around his neck. Don't get the wrong idea, though. I'm not impressed, he added casually as he began undoing the weights strapped to his body. I'm just not outright disappointed either, even if I was holding back. Deku let out a small sigh of relief. She wasn't sure how much longer she could have kept up if the fight had continued. Aizawa wasted no time turning his back to her, leaping off the platform as the red-clad man known as Vlad King stepped forward, taking his place in the ring. Dash. Why? All Might questioned, eyes fixed on the small rodent-like principal as they observed the match between Aizawa and young Midoriya. Nezu let out a quiet chuckle, casting a mischievous glance at the former number 1 hero. I needed to see if she had your spirit, he replied simply. But the answer didn't sit well with All Might. His lips pressed into a thin line, unsatisfied. Nezu turned his gaze back toward the ring, watching intently. I'm no fool, Toshi. You've been searching for a successor for years, someone capable of carrying the weight of your quirk, someone truly worthy of becoming a hero. The blonde remained silent, giving only a slight nod, waiting for Nezu to continue. But the burden Deku will shoulder isn't just your quirk. She will have to become the next symbol of peace. And judging by how your time in your hero form is decreasing, that time will come sooner than you'd like. Toshinori knew this. Of course, he knew. His time as the symbol of peace was limited. A few years at most, and within that time, he needed to nurture a hero capable of carrying the weight that came with such a role, a hero who could stand fearless in the face of danger, whose very presence could reassure the people. Once she learns to control your quirk, Toshi, the girl will be unstoppable. But as it stands, Midoriya is vulnerable. All Might clenched his jaw. I need to know her capabilities, to assess what we can improve upon. This test is nothing more than a way to identify her weaknesses. Nezu let out a brief whistle as he watched Deku's foot connect with Aizawa's face. Why this, then? Why not an entrance exam or something similar? The blonde questioned. If she's caught the eye of All Might, then we already know she's worthy of UA, Nezu responded with a knowing smile. But we need to prepare her for the future. Shota is there to test how she handles being stripped of her power. Too many heroes today are rendered helpless when their quirk isn't in the ideal environment. She needs to know how to fight, quirk or not. And Vlad? He'll test her ability to think on her feet, of course, Nezu said with a playful wink before breaking into a small fit of laughter. And, let's be honest, it makes for an entertaining show, wouldn't you agree? If you were going to let her join UA anyway, then why do I have to sponsor her? Why risk the public discovering our connection through the recommendation program? That ever-present, knowing smile on Nezu's face irked the blonde to no end. If there was a good reason, why not just explain it? Why keep it from him? You, more than anyone, understand the importance of a symbol, Nezu began. All Might gave a hesitant nod, unsure where the principal was going with this. You are the pillar that holds society together. If you were to retire, or worse, if something were to happen to you, the repercussions would be catastrophic. The existence of All Might, of a symbol, is what maintains balance. Crime is at an all-time low. People feel safe because of you. I fail to see how Deku is involved in that, Toshinori admitted, his tone laced with curiosity. When you step down, which, realistically, would be sooner rather than later, society will need a new symbol, a new hero to put their faith in. And who better than the one you trained yourself? The legacy you leave behind? And what about the villains? That will put her in tremendous danger. He clenched his fists. He had already lost too many people. He wouldn't lose her too. We have to face reality, Toshinori, Nezu said softly, turning back to the fight as Vlad King stepped onto the battlefield. Dash. The man was still chuckling as he took his stance, glancing back at Aizawa. That's his way of saying he likes you, kid, Vlad said with a wild grin. Aizawa remained as stoic as ever, though the glint in his eyes betrayed his curiosity. He was genuinely interested in seeing how this match would unfold. Vlad wasted no time preparing himself, droplets of crimson seeping past his gauntlets and pooling at his fingertips. Deku's mind raced. She already knew about his quirk, blood control. He could manipulate his own blood, shaping it into weapons, shields, or even restraining webbing. It was incredibly versatile and dangerous, but it had a drawback: overuse led to fatigue due to blood loss. What was the best way to counter a quirk like that? Air cannon could keep him at a distance, but the transformation process was too complex and slow. She didn't have time. She needed something simple but effective, something with enough range to keep her out of his attack radius. Vlad, much like Aizawa, was an expert at incapacitating opponents. Telescoping limbs? Spring-like limbs? Maybe a combination of both? That wasn't a bad idea. Telescoping limbs would provide reach, while spring-like limbs could enhance her strikes. Her arms began to glow with an iridescent light as she started the transmutation, but before she could complete it, she heard the sharp crack of a whip and Midnight's voice calling out, "Hajime." Oh no. She had only managed to reinforce the outer inch of her skin with metal when the fight was called. The internal mechanics were incomplete. This was bad. She just needed enough time to finish the transmutation. A wave of crimson surged from Vlad's gauntlets, rapidly crystallizing into a spear. The blood hero charged forward, his movements straightforward, deliberately telegraphed. He was testing her reaction. Would she freeze when faced with a potentially lethal attack? But much to his surprise, Deku didn't dodge. She didn't sidestep. Instead, she clenched her metal-coated fist and swung. The impact shattered the tip of the spear into shards, scattering fragments of crystallized blood across the floor. Well. She wasn't half bad. Vlad had already noted her strength from her build and stance, but he hadn't expected her to hit that hard. A grin stretched across his face as he pulled back his arm, the shattered blood fragments rushing back to reassemble the spear. This time, he reinforced the structure, making it far more durable. Metal met blood once again. This time, the spear held firm, scraping against Deku's hardened skin. Her green eyes widened in surprise. Vlad's grin only grew. "What, you didn't think I was going to make this easy, did you?" No, she thought, steadying herself. This was just getting started. Right away, she abandoned the idea of merging the two schematics. If they weren't strong enough to even put a crack in the blood spear, then what would be? Vlad saw his opportunity and seized it. That brief moment of surprise that had caught Deku off guard was all he needed to secure his victory. More blood surged from his gauntlet, moving swiftly and wrapping around Deku's arm. His pupils narrowed as he willed the blood to crystallize, locking his opponent in place. Deku struggled, getting pushed back. Even with the added weight slowing Vlad down, he still had superior upper body strength. Now, her feet scraped helplessly against the floor as he inched her closer and closer to the outer edges of the arena. No. She attempted to channel transmutation into her legs, but with her shoes on, she wouldn't be able to generate something effective in time. Vlad King's grin widened as he noticed the flicker of panic in the green-haired teen's expression. He pushed harder, speeding up the movement toward the edge. Only a few more feet. No. She needed more power. Something. Anything. She slammed her metallic hand against the crimson crystals encasing her arm, but not even a scratch formed. Vlad had learned from their last encounter. This time, he had solidified his blood completely, leaving no easy way out. 1 foot. No. She refused to let this opportunity slip away. With no other options, Deku threw her arm back, tearing down every mental barrier she had placed on One for All. Vlad's grin deepened as he formed a shield of hardened blood on his other arm. Give it up, kid. This was her one and only chance. Summoning every ounce of power into her arm, she drove it forward. Smash! Her fist hadn't even made direct contact before the sheer force sent Vlad flying, shattering the crystallized blood into millions of tiny fragments. He shot out of the circular arena, propelled by the impact. A powerful shockwave burst from where her punch landed, kicking up dust and sending ripples of wind throughout the massive training hall. Several pro heroes nearby stumbled from the sheer force of it. Deku's eyes widened in shock as a sharp pain shot through her arm, tears stinging the edges of her vision. Looking down, she saw that despite the metal reinforcing her limb, it was bent at an awkward angle, clearly broken. Although it could have been worse. She blinked away the tears just as a loud crack echoed through the air. Her head snapped up, her gaze locking onto Vlad, who was now buried in the outer wall. Deep fractures webbed out from the point of impact. She turned toward All Might, who gave her a sheepish smile. I may have forgotten to mention that your body might not be ready to handle one for all at 100% just yet. Deku groaned, frustration and pain evident as she gestured to her broken arm. And this? She exclaimed. Before All Might could answer, Nezu suddenly appeared, startling them both. We call Recovery Girl, of course. Mastering one for all was proving to be more challenging than Deku had anticipated. After years of training with her original quirk, she had assumed that learning to use a second would be simple, just a matter of applying what she had already mastered. But reality had been far different. With transmutation, there were no restrictions on power, she simply controlled the area she wanted to alter. But one for all required precision. If she channeled too much energy into a single limb, it would break, just like it had during her first real use of the quirk. For the first 2 weeks of training with All Might, they focused entirely on meditation. Finding the perfect balance, enough power to be effective but not so much that it caused damage, was crucial. 8%. That was the threshold before her bones began to creak in protest, before arcs of green lightning scorched her skin whenever she summoned one for all. Today, though, they were testing something new. She had suggested using transmutation to reinforce her limbs with metal before activating one for all. In theory, this would not only eliminate the recoil from her attacks but also allow her to handle higher percentages of power safely. Toshinori watched with interest, a grin forming as Deku's arms began to glow. Within moments, they were fully transformed, sleek and mechanical, composed entirely of steel. He gave an approving nod. Now, let's see it in action. Deku focused, summoning one for all. Energy surged through her body but stopped abruptly at her shoulder blades, right where her flesh had been transmuted into metal. She frowned, attempting again. Nothing. No matter how hard she tried, her power felt restricted. As if it had encountered an invisible barrier. Was it her transmutation? Did the two quirks refuse to work together? Her brows furrowed in thought. One for all was, at its core, an enhancement quirk, one that dramatically increased both physical abilities and the power of any other quirk the user possessed. So why weren't they integrating? She dismissed the transmutation, starting over. This time, she coated only her skin in metal rather than transforming her entire arm. As she activated one for all once more, realization struck. One for all functioned as energy, it needed a clear pathway to flow. By transmuting her arms into solid metal, she had unknowingly blocked that flow. The energy simply couldn't pass through non-organic material. That sparked another thought. The lightning that crackled around her body whenever she used one for all. Would it move through metal if the material was conductive? Her typical transmutations were composed of titanium. It was strong, lightweight, corrosion-resistant, and durable. However, it was also a poor conductor. She had specifically chosen it to avoid becoming a walking lightning rod against electricity-based quirks. She shook the thought away. Today's goal was to test reinforcement, not material conductivity. That would have to wait. As she activated one for all again, she could feel the energy surging beneath her metallic skin. She gradually increased the percentage, noting that while her bones protested, her skin remained unharmed. The titanium prevented the usual burns caused by high-voltage discharges. At 13%, her arms trembled. To counteract this, she transmuted her bones into titanium as well. Instantly, the shakiness stopped. Satisfied, she pushed further. At 16%, she finally felt strain in her muscles, signaling her limit. She had doubled her previous threshold. Looking up, she grinned at her mentor. Toshinori's brows lifted in surprise before a wide, proud smile spread across his face. How much? He asked, anticipation in his voice. 16, she answered. Toshinori let out an impressed chuckle. Incredible. In his excitement, he unconsciously shifted into his muscle form, his white shirt and beige cargo shorts stretching against his frame. That's a major milestone, he continued. Once you pass 15%. He grinned, flexing his right arm as he prepared to demonstrate. Cementos, he called, turning toward the pro hero. The cement hero, who typically oversaw their training sessions, tilted his head toward All Might, following the direction of his gaze before nodding in understanding. With a swift motion, he extended his hands toward the floor. A wave of cement surged forward, forming a perfectly rectangular concrete slab about 10 feet high and 5 feet wide, positioned approximately 20 feet away from All Might. This was the standard target used in their training. However, instead of charging toward the wall as expected, All Might remained firmly planted in place. With a single, powerful motion, he thrust his arm forward in a punch. Deku felt her throat go dry as she witnessed the concrete wall explode upon impact, not from direct contact, but from the sheer force of the wind pressure generated by his strike. Chunks of cement flew in all directions. You've got this. All Might encouraged with a confident grin, turning toward his protege. Deku blanched, realizing the sheer strength her mentor had just demonstrated. He had shattered the barrier without even touching it. Stepping closer, All Might placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Now, it's your turn. From the sidelines, Cementos grinned before once again pressing his hands to the floor. The scattered debris liquefied and quickly reassembled, restoring the wall to its original form. Deku steadied herself, pulling her fist back and planting her feet firmly against the ground. Inhaling deeply, she focused on channeling her quirk through her arm. With determination, she struck forward, jolting slightly when she saw a spiderweb-like crack form at the center of the slab. She glanced at her arm in astonishment, while All Might let out a hearty laugh. I only used about 30% for my demonstration. He explained. One day, you'll be able to do the same. Gesturing to Cementos once again, All Might watched as an array of differently sized concrete slabs began materializing around the arena, targets designed to test Deku's newfound abilities. Now that we've uncovered your new limits, it's time to push them further. A humbling lesson. Aizawa had agreed to spar with her, a prospect that had initially filled Deku with excitement. Testing her abilities against a pro hero would be a valuable learning experience. However, Quirk-enhanced sparring with Aizawa was proving to be far more challenging than she had anticipated. At first, she believed their physical abilities weren't too drastically different. After all, during their initial sessions, she had managed to land a few solid hits on him. But what she had failed to consider was that Aizawa had been wearing training weights the entire time. The moment their sparring began, his quirk activated, immediately nullifying hers before she could even begin to channel her energy. She noticed brief windows of opportunity, moments when his hair would fall, signaling a lapse in his ability, but they were fleeting, lasting mere fractions of a second. Even if she recognized them, capitalizing on such brief openings was nearly impossible. Training her new quirk was proving to be more frustrating than expected. In theory, her approach was sound. First, she would activate Transmutation to fortify her body, then briefly channel One for All to execute an attack before cutting off the energy flow. The issue, however, lay in the time required to activate both abilities. The process wasn't instantaneous, and as Aizawa had ruthlessly drilled into her, any delay in combat was a liability. It created a vulnerability, an opening that a skilled opponent could exploit. While training with All Might had boosted her confidence, her twice-weekly sparring sessions with Aizawa ensured she remained grounded. Nothing was more humbling than struggling to land a single blow while her opponent barely exerted himself. She had roughly 6 weeks to refine her skills before she would have to demonstrate her progress. While recommended students weren't required to take the entrance exam, they still had to prove their worth, displaying the abilities that had earned them a pro hero's endorsement. And since it was All Might who had recommended her, the pressure was immense. She didn't want to let down the man who had placed so much faith in her potential. An unexpected encounter. Lost in thought, Deku found herself once again making her way to the Training Development Lab, TDL. Training always helped clear her mind, allowing her to focus solely on her quirk rather than the mounting pressure of expectations. However, as she stepped into the facility, she was met with an unexpected sight. The massive training space had been divided, with one half occupied by another session. Aside from All Might and Aizawa, who apparently had extra time on his hands after expelling an entire class, Deku rarely interacted with others from UA. Occasionally, students would pass through the training area, but none ever approached her, especially after witnessing how intensely focused she became when honing her abilities. Curiosity sparked within her. What kind of quirk required such an elaborate setup? The scene before her was chaotic. The far end of the arena was filled with random geometric cement structures jutting out at odd angles. Pillars tilted unpredictably, some protruding from the walls, creating an almost labyrinth-like formation. At first, she speculated it might be an agility exercise, perhaps someone training to navigate complex terrain. But the tight spacing between structures made that theory unlikely. Could it be a quirk related to size manipulation? Someone with the ability to shrink could potentially maneuver through the narrow gaps, but even then, some sections appeared nearly impossible to traverse. She tapped a finger against her chin, pondering the possible nature of this exercise. Her question was quickly answered when, to her astonishment, a head suddenly emerged from one of the concrete pillars a few feet away. Bright blue eyes locked onto hers with curiosity. "Hey!" The disembodied head greeted casually. "You're not a UA student?" Fighting back the instinct to blurt out what in the world? Deku quickly composed herself. She hesitated momentarily before choosing her words carefully. "I train here," she clarified. "With all might." "Oh." Recognition dawned on the boy's face. "Midoriya, right?" he asked excitedly. "There was a rumor going around, but I didn't think it was actually true," he chuckled, but then his eyes widened in realization. The rest of his body suddenly emerged from the concrete, revealing a blonde-haired boy who, to Deku's horror, was completely unclothed. "Tagata Mirio." He introduced himself enthusiastically, extending a hand. However, his expression shifted when he noticed her reaction, or rather, where her gaze was fixed. "Oh." A sheepish look crossed his face before he quickly sank back into the pillar. "My bad," he muttered. "Give me a second." Deku hastily turned away as Mirio dashed over to retrieve his gym clothes, dressing in record time. Once properly clothed, he approached her again, this time with a broad grin, extending his hand once more. "Tagata Mirio." After a brief chuckle, Deku took his hand, shaking it firmly. "Midoriya Deku." Although the introduction was somewhat awkward, Deku appeared pleased by the opportunity to befriend a UA student. "Sorry for taking up so much of your space. Principal Nezu was very insistent that I train here today for some reason." Deku offered a small smile, waving a hand dismissively. "It's okay. It doesn't bother me. There's more than enough space." Mirio chuckled before his expression brightened with excitement. "I have to introduce you to Sir Naitai," he exclaimed with a grin. "Sir Naitai?" Deku stammered, internally chastising herself for the slip. The pro-hero who was once All Might's sidekick? No matter how much she matured, at her core, she was still the same hero enthusiast she had been since childhood. Mirio nodded, his grin unwavering. "The very same. I think he'd be thrilled to meet All Might's student." Right on cue, Deku heard the distinct metallic creak of a door swinging open. Instinctively, she turned her head toward the entrance. A tall, imposing man stepped through, his sharp features accentuated by a formal, light gray suit. If not for his strikingly bright hair and commanding presence, Sir Naitai might have appeared rather unassuming. At first, his expression was neutral, even kind. But as his gaze landed on Deku, that kindness vanished. His eyes widened briefly in shock before narrowing into a piercing glare, his expression taut with barely contained fury. The tension in the room became almost suffocating, and Deku suddenly found her throat uncomfortably dry. The world around her seemed unnaturally still, yet each step Sir Naitai took reverberated like a drumbeat in her ears. Then, another door opened with a creak. Relief washed over Deku as she spotted the familiar, almost ghostly form of her mentor entering from the opposite side of the training facility. All Might and Sir Naitai locked eyes the moment they saw each other. Deku expected smiles, a warm reunion between former allies, but what she witnessed was anything but friendly. All Might forced an uneasy smile, while Sir Naitai's features remained rigid, his lips pressed into a firm line. "A word?" The green-haired man finally broke the silence. Toshinori nodded, and the two awkwardly stepped aside to speak in private. Sir Naitai gestured toward their two students, who had already shrugged off the tension between their mentors and were now engaged in lively conversation. "Mirio told me about the rumors. A middle schooler granted special permission by Principal Nezu to train at UA under the #1 hero." Toshinori simply offered a knowing smile, unsure of where his former sidekick was going with this. "And she is?" The question hung in the air, unspoken but understood. "My successor, yes," All Might confirmed. A mirthless chuckle escaped Sir Night's lips. "Fate certainly has a sense of irony, doesn't it? Who would have thought that the student you'd choose to inherit One for All would bear such a striking resemblance to the very man who forced you to find a successor in the first place? His tone dripped with bitterness, the weight of old wounds resurfacing. All Might let out a similarly humorless chuckle. If you had told me back then that I'd be training his child, I wouldn't have believed it either. Sir Night Eye froze. His breath caught in his throat. He had assumed All Might was joking, but as he took in his former mentor's solemn expression, realization struck like a bolt of lightning. You, he whispered in disbelief. You're serious? All Might gave a single nod. Sir Night Eye's body tensed. His mind raced. This was impossible. There was no way, All Might would knowingly train the child of his greatest adversary. Did he even understand the risk he was taking? What if this was some elaborate scheme orchestrated by All for One? That man was a master manipulator, a strategist who had built and led an empire of villains with ruthless precision. He had promised to destroy All Might, not just physically, but emotionally, strategically, methodically. And now, All Might had willingly passed his greatest power on to the offspring of that very enemy? Panic surged through Sir Night Eye's veins. If this girl inherited both her father's abilities and One for All, she would be unstoppable. If she harbored any hidden allegiance to her lineage, they would all be in grave danger. He knew he was jumping to conclusions, his fears could be nothing more than paranoia. But when it came to All for One, there was no room for doubt. No room for mistakes. Before his thoughts could settle, his body moved on instinct. In an instant, he lunged forward, startling All Might as he charged toward Deku. She saw him coming, but Sir Night Eye was fast, too fast for her to react in time. Mirio gasped, stumbling back as his mentor grabbed Deku by the collar, hoisting her slightly off the ground. Their eyes locked, and Sir Night Eye activated his quirk. He had to know. Mirio could see the confusion and indignation on Deku's face, mirroring his own emotions. But Sir Night Eye wasn't seeing her, his mind was completely absorbed in the visions flooding his senses. His expression turned blank as he glimpsed what lay ahead in Deku's future. Before she could retaliate, before she could even fully process what was happening, he abruptly released her, his hands trembling as he staggered backward. All Might rushed toward him, concern etched across his face. But Sir Night Eye barely registered it. He stumbled, barely keeping himself upright as his vision swam. Then, without warning, he doubled over, hands clutching his stomach as nausea overwhelmed him. His glasses slipped from his face, clattering onto the ground. His body convulsed, and despite his best efforts to maintain composure, his stomach revolted against him. He had never reacted so violently to a vision before. Sensei! Night Eye! Mirio and All Might called out simultaneously, alarmed. Mirio quickly crouched beside him, gripping his mentor's shoulders to steady him. All Might's voice was quiet, yet heavy with concern. What did you see? Sir Night Eye swallowed hard, his throat raw from the sickness. His hands still trembled, his legs felt weak, but he forced himself to answer. A hero. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. The vision had been clear. The future would not be kind to one Midoriya Deku. Dear YouTube community, I hope you found this content enjoyable and insightful. I'd love to hear your thoughts, feel free to share them in the comments below. Your feedback means a lot. Best regards. 6 Path Weeb.